Hello, it's Garret Biss. Thank you for joining me on this live presentation. I'm going to take a minute and just wait for some people to join and add some invites or throw some invites out there. If you are checking in, please throw your name in the comments so I can see who's here and who's joining me. I'm going to click on a few more invites. So I'm really excited tonight to experiment with this screen share capability for Facebook Lives. I haven't experimented with that before. I haven't done one before, so excited to try that out tonight and see how that works. All right, so I've been haven't done many Facebook Lives in a while. Samantha, thank you for joining. I hope you're doing well. I've been a little silent on the Facebook Live front for a little while. And one of the reasons is I've been back in school, spent the last 6 months studying positive psychology and earning a certificate of applied positive psychology. So that's kept me a little busy, but it's also really exciting because it's given me a lot of stuff to share in this group, and many things, new tools and ideas that I can share with people to help them in their lives in many different ways, and especially in this group with people that are living in addiction recovery. So thank you for joining me. What I'm going to talk about tonight, and because I can't do a live video, I thought I'd throw a picture of myself on the screen for those that don't know me personally, just to put a face to a name. What I want to talk about tonight is thriving in recovery. Specifically, how to leverage some of the tools of applied positive psychology to help people thrive in addiction recovery and live into their higher potential. So thanks for joining me for this. If you have any questions during this, please throw them in the chat box. I'll answer what I can as we go along, and then after I've clicked through some slides and shared some of the presentation, we'll do some Q&A. So let's get rolling. All right, so thriving in recovery. With this program, what I'm going to talk about is a program I developed, a positive psychology-based program for individuals that previously suffering from substance abuse or addiction. So how can we use some of these principles to empower individuals with certain challenges that face common challenges so that they can use some of this positive psychology to thrive in their recovery? And the program is designed to help empower individuals to do many things. So one's escape the grasp of addiction or substance abuse. Two, live into their higher potential. And really, when it comes down to is just thriving in recovery and learning to live into that higher potential and experience the success and the fulfillment and the happiness and everything that we all want and deserve, but doing that in recovery and doing it with the positive psychology. So took a lot of what I learned in my class and put this program together, some ways that we can use positive psychology to help people. But before I talk about how positive psychology can serve people in addiction recovery, I want to lay a little bit of background. So one thing that drew my attention to this, and I've talked about a little bit before on some Facebook Lives, is the reality of addiction in America. There's an estimated 84, well, more than this, 100 and, if you do the math, 103, 104 million people that are suffering from somewhere on the spectrum of addiction and recovery. So this is a great graph that I've referenced before that I got from my friend Jean LaCour at the NET Institute, the Center for Addiction Recovery Education. And this shows is that in America alone, of the 300-some million Americans, there's about 60 million people that are currently abusing some substance and facing consequences from that abuse. And then 23 million people estimated that are chronically addicted. And of those chronically addicted people, about 2.3 million people in some form of treatment, so more like a rehab treatment center or a short-term treatment center. And then an estimated 24 million people who are living in recovery. So if you add up all those numbers, there's about 1 in 3 people, their lives are touched by addiction or substance abuse in some way. And when you think about the fact that those 3 people also have families and friends and jobs, Well, the secondary or the secondary effects of people that are struggling with addiction or substance abuse, it really touches everybody. It really affects everybody in America, because those people that are struggling in their lives, it then affects the way that they can show up at work. It affects the way that they show up in relationships. So really everybody in America is touched in some way by addiction or substance abuse. The reality of addiction, so my understanding, my perception of addiction, I understand that it's really just a part of the human condition. And by that I mean when part of living life is facing challenges, feeling emotions, having circumstances that we want to escape or avoid or numb from, or sometimes we just want to celebrate. And to do this, we often seek things outside of our body to escape, to avoid, to numb. Sometimes that's just binge watching on Netflix, or it's running to get some fast food that we know is not great for our body, but might make us feel, good for a moment. It might be, some of the social media apps and things that we use that help us escape from things that are on our mind. But the reality is, it's part of that escaping, that avoiding, that numbing. That's part of the human condition. And those same things that we do to escape or avoid or numb in our life are the same actions that people do that lead to substance abuse and addiction. It's just that the place that they are in their life, the things that drove them towards a certain substance or a certain activity or a certain behavior, it kind of grabbed them at a place, or it created different consequences in their life, or a different reality in their life than other people. But one thing that really fuels my compassion for people that are struggling with addiction or substance abuse or living in recovery is the thought that I'm no different than anybody else. I think that we are all a product of our nature and our nurture, which is the place that we start out in life and those experiences that we've had along the way. And somebody else who might have had their life, toppled by addiction or is living in recovery, they're not different, better, or worse than anybody else. They just went down a certain life path and followed these certain things that we all do as part of the human condition that created a certain consequence in their life. But I don't see one of the things that really frustrates me, a pet peeve that I have, is the hypocrisy of judging certain people in addiction or that have had a history of addiction, and judging them as though they've done something that's tremendously different than what the rest of us have done or tried. But one person who overindulges in fast food, or has piles of debt that they've racked up from their bad spending habits because of an escape or release that they've sought by buying things. I don't see that as any different than somebody who is unfortunately experimented with something that was addictive and brought much worse consequences to them. With that, when I look at the trends of things that we see in America, it really concerns me for what the future of addiction is going to be like, substance abuse and addiction, if we don't make some changes. So those means that people use to escape or avoid or numb, whether it's that food, whether it's spending more time on Netflix, or spending more time on social media, or whatever it is that somebody might do to escape or numb, there's some things in our current society, in our current culture, that are paving the way, I think, for more addictive tendencies and abuse tendencies in the future. Those same things that are feeding our tendency towards the instant gratification that we all seek, and those things that we do to escape and numb it. Now they're in our handheld devices. There was an article on National Geographic talking about the science behind addiction, and there was a gentleman that was talking about his experience speaking in Las Vegas, talking about how he was discussing addictive behaviors, especially in gaming, and what the gaming industry can do to prevent people from having their lives toppled by an addiction to gambling. And he said the irony of it was, or the sad truth was, that right in the next conference room there was somebody with an app. It was a conference for app developers, and they were touting their ability to make apps more addictive to humans by tapping into some of our neurology, or creating certain chemical responses in our brain to make us more addictive. So there's things that are working against us, that are kind of hardwiring us or paving the way for us to need or to require those external stimuli to escape or to avoid or to numb the pains in our life. So one thing I've also noticed about traditional approaches is, and we'll talk about this a little bit in the next slide, is the difference between positive psychological approach and some of the traditional approaches, many traditional approaches to addiction or to helping people in recovery are what is called like defect focus, or they focus on defects or problems, and they operate on what's referred to as a treatment paradigm, and they try to fix certain defects in people that that created the circumstances for them to become addicted. Whereas positive psychology looks at leveraging things that actually come up here in a second, leveraging things that are going well in a person's life to help them achieve higher success or live into higher potential. And this is a graph from John Travis's work that really shows this. So if you look at the bottom, and I think you can see my mouse on the screen, if you look at the bottom at this treatment paradigm, a lot of traditional approaches to addiction and recovery focus on the treatment paradigm, and they look at those disabilities or those things that are wrong with people and try to eliminate the wrong, if you will, or eliminate the defect. Well, in that in that end of the spectrum, the best that you can hope for is to get to a neutral point. But if you only look at defects and solving defects, then you never really empower somebody to move beyond that neutral point. Where positive psychology focuses on the wellness paradigm and looks at what somebody is doing well, or what strengths somebody has and how they can leverage that for greater success. And when you work somebody out of the the illness spectrum into the wellness spectrum of life and of recovery, you can use those same strengths to help somebody move beyond that neutral point and really live into a potential that is higher than or better than what they might have experienced before their addiction or before their substance abuse. This program that I've created on helping people thrive in recovery is predicated on a human potential model for addiction, or understanding of addiction and substance abuse. And this line right here, what this graph represents is a person's human potential. And I think that we all have an incredible amount of human potential, or true potential, that we can live into. But for any of us, the amount of potential that we're living into at any given time, as on this line, our actualized potential, or the amount of potential that we're living into, and the ways that success and joy and happiness and contribution are showing up in our life, I refer to as actualized potential. And I believe that actualized potential, or where we're showing up in our own life, there's many different things that you might identify as factors to somebody's actualized potential. It might be education, it might be environment, it might be the tools, the resources, the family, whatever it is. You can look at somebody's life and what one person leverages to live into their higher potential that somebody else doesn't have. But when you really look at it, you can find stories of people from any kind of family background, from any kind of education background, from any kind of socioeconomic class or demographic, that have lived into an extraordinary amount of their true potential. So when I kind of analyzed it and looked at what it was that stood that helps people separate themselves, or what were those factors that really contributed to somebody's actualized potential that could be affected, I see it as a product of somebody's self-efficacy and their positive affect, as represented here by SE and PA. So one's self-efficacy is a person's belief in their own abilities and their belief in their ability to meet challenges and to succeed. Now, it's very similar and sometimes used interchangeably with self-esteem. The difference being that self-esteem is more about a person's feeling good, or being, their state of being, whereas self-efficacy is in their belief about their ability to do a certain thing or to achieve a certain thing. And positive affect is a person's emotional state that they experience in a particular moment. So one's propensity towards experiencing positive affects, like positive sensations, positive emotions, positive sentiments, is their positive affect, and their positive affect creates a consequence of how they interact with their surroundings. So any person, and the potential that we're living into can fluctuate throughout our lives depending on the challenges that we face or depending on the successes that we've had. But where we show up in any given moment is a combination of our self-efficacy and our positive affect. And of course, if you face certain challenges, it will affect your self-efficacy. If you've had recent failures or recent setbacks or faced recent challenges, then of course your self-efficacy may diminish and your positive affect may diminish. Now, looking on this graph, there's a couple different areas here which I'll label in a second, but you can see that as somebody's actualized potential decreases, their behaviors and their tendencies change depending on where they are, what zone they show up in this certain graph. But at some point, enough challenges, enough struggle, enough setbacks or failures, temporary failures can be faced so that it drives somebody's actualized potential down to a point where they cross a certain line, or they cross this line of departure. So, and we'll talk a little bit about what drives that up and what drives that down. These three zones that I've identified are thriving. So when somebody's really living high into their actualized potential, they're thriving. They're living well. They're living into their potential. When their actualized potential decreases to a certain point where they kind of get in this yellow zone, then they're more of in a driving state. They're just kind of going through the motions or getting by. And then as you cross that line of departure, as you get knocked down to the point where everything in your life is stacked against you, the point that your self-efficacy and your positive affect are diminished, and you cross that point, and you get into the survival state, which is where we find people that are active addiction. And in that driving state, that yellow zone, that's where we see a lot of people that are currently abusing substances more to negative consequence. So what's this look like? So if you're living in the thriving area, what's that look like? How do we know if somebody is? Well, they're engaged in a life with purpose. So whatever it is that they're engaged in or what they're doing, it has a lot of purpose. It has a lot of meaning. If you were to look at their life, you would say it's defined by hope, by joy, by happiness. They appear and they come off as confident, and they're very resilient with their life. They're passionate, they feel valued, and things have meaning. So the things in their life that they're engaged in, they have specific meaning. External stimulus, so those things that we turn to beyond our body to avoid, to escape, to numb, or to celebrate, those external stimulus, they're used for a little gain. So when somebody that's thriving indulges in some external stimulus, they get a little bit of a gain, but it comes with a drastic cost or something a lot to lose. And here's a chart, and this is, I see a correlation between this and between those external stimulus. Here's the overall life satisfaction, and this is what I'm looking at. So if somebody is thriving, they're kind of living up here along this line. It's not a very steep slope. And if that blue line represents an indulgence in some external stimuli, maybe they're using a substance, maybe they're drinking alcohol, maybe they're enjoying a dessert, or spending money on some luxury that they don't really need. Well, you get a certain boost from that. You get a dopamine boost. You get some positive feeling. But if you're really thriving, if you're really living into your potential, then that gain that you're going to get is not going to be very substantial. You might be having a great time, and that glass of wine helps you have a slightly better time, or that nice meal that you go out and indulge on might help you increase your positive affect or your self-efficacy a little bit, but it's not going to be drastic. And those external stimuli by people that are thriving are typically used moderately to enhance their joy, not as much to escape the struggles, the challenges that they're facing in their life, but used instead to enhance the joy that they're feeling. And their happiness set point. So one thing that I learned studying positive psychology is we all have like a set point for happiness. And basically what that is as we face challenges, as we get knocked down, or as we have huge wins, it will increase or decrease the happiness that we're feeling at that moment. But after a short period of time, it will tend to come back to a certain set point. And there's even studies that show people that have had like tragic things happen in their life, people that have been in car accidents and are now paraplegics, and they look at their life years later, and their happiness, their life satisfaction is about back where it was before that tragic event. It's come back to a certain set point. Similarly with people that have won the lottery and they're ecstatic and their happiness goes through the roof for a short period of time, they often find that their happiness in a couple of years comes back to a certain set point. And our set point is set by different things. Happiness is a byproduct of, there's really two different forms of happiness. One's eudaimonic happiness. Eudaimonic happiness is that happiness that we feel, that sensation that we feel when we're engaged in something that we're really passionate about. So when we're doing work that we're passionate about, when we have a lot of meaning in our life, and we have that sensation of happiness from in us, that's eudaimonic happiness. And that is opposed to a different kind of happiness, which is hedonic happiness. That's the kind of happiness, that sensation that we feel when we're indulging in a lot of things that bring certain effects to our life. So when we're indulging in things that bring that momentary happiness, we feel that happiness, but it's from a hedonic nature. It's a hedonic nature. So for somebody who's thriving, this is what their life looks like. Now, if you're potential that you're working into moves down to this yellow zone, or temporarily or permanently, or this is just where you're existing in the moment, or a person is existing in the moment, then what's that look like? Well, their life looks like they're really just kind of existing. They're going through the motions more than really living and enjoying their life. They're just kind of, doing the daily grind. Nothing really has a lot of meaning or purpose. Their life looks like more stress than joy, more despair than hope, and more fear than confidence. And the things that they're doing in their life, the things that they're engaged in, lack substantial meaning. So they might be busy doing something, but it doesn't bring a lot of meaning to their life. Those external stimulus, when they turn to external stimulus to escape, to avoid, to numb, like I said, once either it's shopping or spending money on things they don't need, or indulging in some desserts, or splurging on something. They do that for a lot of gain with a little bit to lose. But because they are not really engaged in a lot of things that have much meaning in their life, then the consequence that those external stimuli have don't really take a lot away from their life. And they'll engage in things even aware of the consequences they would bring. For me in my life, there were times that that I've lived in this area and I would indulge in things, whether it was alcohol or whether it was splurging, spending money. I'd be aware of the consequences that it would bring to my life, and still choose to engage in it in a way that I knew would bring about certain consequences. Those external stimuli are abused to create a sensation of happiness and joy. So when somebody in this frame, speaking maybe from somebody with a substance abuse or alcohol abuse, these are people that really live to the end of the day so they can have that happy hour cocktail at the end of every day. They're really relying on that escape or that avoiding or that numbing. And this, it's not just alcohol, it's not just drugs. At times in my life when I've been like this, which I have recently, where I feel like I'm just kind of driving and not really engaged, that I run home and I start, Netflix binging or doing things that I'm just really just numbing, really just escaping the thoughts in my mind, or things that are going on in my life, or just trying to numb a sensation, or trying to enjoy something. But those periods when somebody is driving in their life, they're using that external stimulus more for maintaining their happiness than amplifying it. So here on the graph, so that same blue line, now you can see a drastic increase in happiness. So now the person's driving through life, they're in that yellow zone. Now that glass of wine that they might have, or that fancy dinner they might splurge on, is going to have a drastic increase in their momentary life satisfaction or their momentary happiness. And their happiness set point is, let me back up one right there. Their happiness set point is big hedonic. So a lot of their happiness comes from their splurging and things, from their hedonic nature, and a little bit of their happiness or satisfaction comes from the eudaimonic means or pathways. Now, when somebody crosses that line, they get into that active addiction. Now, what their life looks like is they're just trying to survive. They're just trying to get from day to day, and they're relying on whatever that external stimulus is. Their life is defined by stress. It's defined by despair and by fear. Again, that external stimulus is needed to survive. Now they're not using that external stimulus to climb the happiness. They're using it because the moment they stop, they start sliding backwards on that happiness scale. And they'll continue to commit actions regardless of known consequences, whether or not they know that their action is going to create a consequence, and they do it anyway because they're down in that red zone and they're striving. So a lot of the traditional programs, some of the traditional recovery programs or 12-step programs, they do a really good job of helping people get out of this red zone. But they tend to, I think an arrow is supposed to go there. But they tend to just help somebody move from that red zone back up to that line of departure. Now, one thing that's discussed a lot in addiction and recovery is whether or not there's ever a cure for recovery. Some people say that there is, some people say that you can't be. Well, I think that, if there is a cure, now I'm not saying that somebody can be cured of addiction, but I think if there is a cure, then it would be found in helping somebody move so far into their potential that draw or that allure of the drug or of that external stimulus loses its allure, and the resilience against using those certain things it diminishes to the point where it's no longer a factor. So if there is such a thing as a cure, then I think that's what it is. And in times that I've been living in that green and really living into my high potential, I don't want to engage in certain activities. I don't want to indulge in certain things because I know that the cost is too good and it will take away from whatever it is that I'm engaged in that's bringing all that meaning into my life. Oh, there we go. So there goes the arrow. All right, so one way to think about human potential, and one way I talk about it or kind of draw it out to give a graph. So I've got an engineering background. I like seeing things in pictures. One thing to think about where somebody lies on that chart is maybe it could be represented by a hot air balloon. And something that affects the height that a hot air balloon will go to, or how high a hot air balloon will fly, is the weights that are holding it down. So the lift of that balloon, the lift that's pulling somebody into their higher potential, is created by their positive beliefs, by their strengths, by their recent wins, successes that they've had recently, by their sense of worth, and by their capacity for the positive emotions and their capacity for leaning into their potential and taking on new challenges, and their capacity to succeed when they face challenges. Those things that hold somebody down are those losses, those recent failures, internal defects that somebody might feel is just wrong with them. The environment has a huge factor on that. People, can thrive in an environment when that environment is sufficient for them to thrive, but you take that same person and put them in a negative environment, and many times it will negatively affect their potential and how much they live into. Recent challenges, those obstacles and those struggles are all things that can hold somebody down from living into their potential. And a person's potential is really set, the limit of somebody's potential is really set by limiting beliefs. I think a lot of times as self-efficacy as what somebody believes is possible for them, whereas a limiting belief is what somebody thinks is possible in the world. So, I've talked to people before that didn't think it was possible to earn 6 figures in a year. They had a limiting belief that somebody from their background with their education could not earn more than 6 figures in a year. But that was her limiting belief. So that was that was kind of a ceiling of achievement that she would never surpass if she didn't change that limiting belief. But all of us have certain limiting beliefs on what we think is possible in the world. The important thing to realize is that the height of what you will achieve in your own life is set by your limiting beliefs. Whether you go up or down on that spectrum of living into your potential is one thing, but your limiting beliefs ultimately sets the cap. So traditional psychological approaches, some traditional programs, again, they focus on those defects or those things that is holding somebody back, and they try to get rid of them. Positive psychology, one, deals with limiting beliefs so that people can live into a higher potential than they thought possible before, and then helps them live into their potential by growing that positive affect and that self-efficacy. So thriving in recovery with APPs, or applied positive psychology. The program I just finished was through the Flourishing Center, which is based out of Penn in the Institute in Pennsylvania. And it focuses on 6 different pathways to flourishing. What they're focused on is helping people flourish or people thrive in their life. And it focuses on 6 different pathways. Of those 6, I picked 4 of the pathways, or 4 different areas of life that somebody can focus on to live into some more of their potential and to leverage that positive psychology. Really what I was doing when I tried to put this program together was find essentially the minimum effective dose of positive psychology that somebody would need to make the biggest impact on their life. If we look at, there's a term in medicine with drugs, like what's the minimum effective dose of a certain drug that you would need to take to achieve a desired effect. Well, with positive psychology, I looked at the 6 pathways and many different topics under each of those 6 pathways, and identified 4 pathways and a handful of topics that I felt somebody could focus on as a minimum effective dose of positive psychology to live into a much higher potential and to find themselves thriving in their life. And those 4 pathways, or those 4 areas of life, are 1, positivity; 2, engagement; 3, meaning; and 4, achievement. And I'll just cover a couple topics of each of those real quickly to show how this thriving in recovery program was put together. Positivity, there's a couple things of content focuses for positivity, the area of positivity. 1 is happiness and set point. So what are the different sources of happiness? How do we bring more of those sources of happiness into our life? And how can we increase our set point? So I mentioned that people tend to have a certain set point throughout their life, but there's also been a lot of research and work done to show how people can change their set point. So, many times people that are in recovery or people that are in addiction, the challenges that they face and the reality they face has driven their happiness set point down really low. Well, if they find themselves in recovery and they don't learn to change their happiness set point, then they're always going to be living near that line of departure and living near that, and having that high propensity for relapse or high chance of relapse. But if we can help somebody reset their happiness set point and increase the happiness that they're getting from that eudaimonic means and from that meaning in their life, then as they face challenges, they might take a dip in their happiness, but they'll come back to to a higher place or to better than before. Another topic is fixed versus growth mindset. So there's a lot of research around Dweck, Dr. Dweck. She wrote a book and did a lot of research on growth mindset. Basically, the difference is there's a fixed mindset is somebody thinks that their skills and abilities and talents are fixed, and the consequence of this is that somebody with a fixed mindset, when they have a failure, they take it as a definition of them personally. By that I mean, a failure to them equates I am a failure, not I failed. Somebody with a growth mindset realizes that their skills, their talents, and their abilities can change and improve over time. They, on the other hand, see a failure or a setback not as a definition of them and their character, but as a temporary experience that they faced and one that they can grow from. And there's ways that people with a tendency towards a fixed mindset can change their mindset and see things differently to bring about more of a growth mindset. Therefore, when they have challenges and setbacks, it doesn't drive them down that human potential ladder. It can actually help strengthen them and drive them up into a higher potential. We'll talk about, in positivity, I'll talk a lot about perception biases. So one thing about human nature is we have a propensity or a tendency towards a negativity bias. And what that means is that we see the things that seem most prevalent or most aware of in our lives are things that are negative. And if you trace back to, why that is and why our brains develop that way, it makes sense. Like if we're out there, we need to be able to identify threats that might, things that might harm us or threaten our loved ones or our friends. So therefore, we have a perception to find and spot those things in our environment or those things in our life that could be a threat. Well, unfortunately, the consequence of this is that it looks like there's a lot more negative things around us than positive things. And when you go through life and your propensity is to find or identify the negative in a situation or the negative in an environment or the negative of an event, then that becomes your reality. You see the negative. But we can, with that understanding, we can be trained to focus on and find the positive that comes from every event or circumstance, as long as we are aware of it. There's another bias or perception bias that we fall prey to, and that's confirmation bias. Confirmation bias simply is our tendency to see things in our life and in our environment that confirm a belief that we have. So if I believe that everybody in my town is a terrible person and everything about my job is horrible, then I will have a bias to see evidence that supports, that confirms that belief that I have. Well, similarly, if I believe that everything in my life is fantastic, that everything about my job is incredible, and everything about my friends in the community are wonderful, then I'll have a bias to confirm that, or I'll have a tendency to see things in my life and in my community that confirm that belief. So when we recognize that and we can train ourselves to have biases that are more positive and more beneficial and more constructive, then we really change the way that we see and interact with the environment around us, and that changes our reality or the life that we experience. Another thing under the topic of positivity is the physiology of happiness. So the chemistry, the brain chemistry. Everything that we do, every behavior that we have, and many of our beliefs are created by the physiological responses in our brains, or the chemicals that are released in our brains during certain times. Many of addictive behaviors and tendencies are driven by dopamine that's released in our brain. We do things to release dopamine, or we'll do things in our life to release oxytocin, which is a calming neurotransmitter, a calming hormone in our body. And when we face stresses or we face things that upset us or frustrate us, or we face challenges, or we have failures, or we have setbacks, that releases other hormones in our brain like adrenaline and cortisol, which are stress and the hormones that are created to prepare us to fight or flight. When we know this, and we know the different things in our life that can create that dopamine response or release that dopamine, or what we can do to overcome some of that cortisol or some of that adrenaline when it's working against us, then we can be empowered and prepared to kind of deal with our brain chemistry in a way that helps us thrive or helps us live into our potential and doesn't hold us back. The reality is, every time that we we get a text message, or we're on social media, or we get a ping of a message on social media, these things create a certain dopamine response. It's the same thing that we feel that's initially released in our body when we eat chocolate or eat sweets or eat things that are high in salt, high in fats, or drink alcohol or take addictive drugs. There's a huge dopamine release that goes into our brain. And that's what trains our body to go and seek that same thing again, and really conditions us towards addiction. Well, recognizing that, we can find natural ways and bring more natural ways of releasing that dopamine into our life, so that we lose our tendency or our drive or our craving for those things that were addictive. The less stress hormones that we have, the less need that we have for artificial releases of oxytocin or dopamine. But if we can bring about the dopamine, the oxytocin in more positive ways, and we can understand it and understand our propensity towards wanting those brain chemicals to be released in our body, then it, once again, it empowers us to make better, more constructive decisions. So positive psychology is taught to people and shared with people using positive psychology interventions. It's a little, sometimes we use the term intervention as, a group of people coming around trying to have an intervention with somebody to get them to stop doing something. This is more a tool. You can think of it as, a worksheet or a technique or a practice that somebody can bring into their life to help affect some of that positive change. So when you hear positive psychology intervention, it really just means a tool or an activity or something that somebody can bring into their life to bring positive psychology into their life. So under positivity, one of the positive psychology interventions I've identified is a personality activity fit diagnosis. And what this is it looks at you, your personality, your tendencies, and it looks at what positive psychology interventions, what practices, whether it's a gratitude practice or whether it's a journaling practice or whether it's exercise, looking at all the different ways that we can bring more of this positive psychology, the benefits of positive psychology into our life. And it identifies what worked best for you, for the individual. Every person's going to have different things that work well for them. This helps you identify what works best for you. If reading a positive or uplifting book, or listening to a positive podcast, or having a gratitude practice, or committing random acts of kindness, for each person, those will have different effects. This is a really neat diagnosis that you can do to figure out what has the greatest effect for you, so that you can focus on that. There's another thing called a daily dozen and a gratitude practice. These are just other interventions that really help capitalize on and bring more of this positivity into your life. And then designing kindness and creating a charity practice is another intervention that we can do in our life to really leverage the effects of that positivity. The next pathway of the 4 is engagement. Engagement, there's the content focus is strengths focused. A lot of times we're conditioned to, and we look at our faults and our failures and our weaknesses. And as we talked about with that confirmation bias, when we look at those negative aspects of us, they seem to be more prevalent. They seem to be more defining of our character and who we are. If we can instead identify and look at our strengths, then we can see ourselves as more of our, of our true character and live into more of our potential. Self-regulation. So we all have the ability to regulate our thoughts and our behaviors and the visions in our head. So when a certain event happens, maybe we have an initial response, or we have a first kind of thought that comes into our head. But we have the ability to regulate those other thoughts that we have and the actions that we take because of that. It takes a little bit of training and awareness, but we have the ability to do that. And when we can regulate our thoughts and our feelings and our emotions, then we have the ability to act on those emotions that are only most beneficial for us. And locus of control. A lot of times we feel like life is happening to us and the things in the world are happening to us, when in reality, we are acting on our life, and we are the ones that are in control of our thoughts, our beliefs, our actions, and the things that we do and the ways that we show up. And when we can move that locus of control back within us, then it empowers us to engage our life in a much better way. Another thing that's a huge issue, especially in addiction, especially in recovery, especially dealing with our tendency to do things, to commit actions or indulge in things that we don't want to, willpower is a huge piece of that. And a lot of the study of willpower shows ways that we can understand and leverage our willpower, increase our willpower during certain times, and recognize when our willpower will be diminished so that we can manage our willpower to commit those actions that we want that will help us live into our higher potential and get the results that we want. Some interventions you can do is a strengths via assessment, which is a way to identify your individual strengths from a list of, I think, 34, 37 strengths, how to identify what your top 5 are so that you can focus on those strengths and take your attention away from those perceived weaknesses that you might have. Another thing is the willpower and activation energy assessment. So there's ways that we can identify how much willpower, how do we increase our willpower to create new habits and to stop old habits. The third pathway of the 4 that I'm talking about is meaning. So as we said, somebody who's really living high into their potential is experiencing a happiness or purpose in their life that comes from engaging in things that are meaningful to them, that they're passionate about, and that bring that purpose into their life. So there's a lot of ways to identify those things that mean the most to you and where you'll get the greatest return. Another topic is post-traumatic growth. So we hear a lot and people study a lot of the effects of post-traumatic stress disorder from prior traumas that have happened in our life, but there's also science and interventions that can help somebody take those same traumatic events and instead of having it be a detriment or a negative impact on their life, really help them turn that around so that they can learn to grow from that same experience and have it drive them into a higher actualized potential as opposed to holding them back. Single story and polarity are some other topics that really help somebody identify meaning and bring more meaning into their life. Some positive psychology interventions. There's a test that you can do to figure out what you're most passionate about and what will bring the greatest joy and happiness into your life. There's an intervention called the theory of the Ers, which looks at how you exemplify kind of what your ideal person would look like and how you can bring some more of that characteristics and more of that those traits that you value the most in yourself. I can bring more of those into a greater realization in your own life. And another intervention of crafting a new story. So how to take some of the challenges and the struggles that you faced in your past and use them to empower you instead of holding you back. And then the last one is achievement. Content focused on this is goal setting. So a little bit different. The positive approach to goal setting is a little different than something you might have seen before. It doesn't just stop at creating smart goals, but then also a plan of implementation where you can identify challenges ahead of time and come up with ways that you'll overcome those challenges, those foreseen challenges, so that you can reach your goals, the goals that you've set. Visualization, so there's a lot of science behind the power of visualization and ways that you can use visualization to remove limiting beliefs and to program and condition yourself to show up much better, to perform much better, to reach your goals, to change negative beliefs that you have about yourself or about the world, and to empower yourself or condition yourself to act and perform a certain way. A couple different kinds of visualizations. Limiting beliefs, as I mentioned before, really that sets the cap for what we can achieve in our life. It puts a limit on what we'll personally achieve, but if we can address some of our limiting beliefs, first identify them and then address them and help remove them, then we can reduce that limit on what we can work into. There's some different interventions that we can use, positive or goals worksheets, visualizations, and markers is a way to create visualizations that will help you the most and bring them into your life and create a practice around them. But those are ways that we can bring more meaning. So the benefits of thriving in recovery, the benefits of using positive psychology to help people thrive in recovery. One, it's developed on a wellness paradigm. So I showed that illness wellness paradigm. It's developed on things that will help leverage somebody's strengths, leverage the positive characteristics and traits of somebody so that they can not just remove the defects in their life and get back to a zero set point or a neutral line, but they can move far beyond that neutral line and live into much higher potential and live into much more happiness and fulfillment and success than they even experienced before their life was defined by substance abuse or addiction. The positive psychology really empowers the addict or the person living in recovery. It empowers them to really take control of their recovery and take control of their life and their life experience in the way that shows up. Once again, it's not looking at defects, it's not looking at weaknesses that hold somebody back or to hold somebody down to a certain life expectation, but it empowers somebody living in recovery to move far beyond. It's a customizable approach. As I mentioned, there's many different positive psychology interventions that are available under each of those pathways. And what's really neat about creating a positive psychology-based recovery program is that you can customize it to find what is going to have the greatest impact for you. Maybe we're focusing more on the meaning area of your life right now is what's going to have the greatest or the most drastic impact. Maybe there's some things in positivity that will help you have the greatest impact and help you live into the highest potential. Well, with a positive psychology practitioner, or whether it's a positive psychology recovery coach, or whether it's just somebody who's been certified or taught positive psychology, you can look at many different interventions and help customize a program for one individual. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach or program. It's not the exact same exercises that everybody has to do. You find out what works most for you so that you can live into your highest potential and only focus on those things that are best. Another thing is it really fuels compassion. Like I said, my background and my compassion comes from this real conviction that none of us is any better or any worse than anybody else. We're all just going through the same human experience. We're all, doing things, bringing things into our life to help go through that human experience. Some people have more negative or more dire consequences from those choices than other people, but really we're all just individuals trying to achieve a certain level of happiness, a certain level of success. We want to feel valued. We want to feel appreciated. Everybody is seeking that same end. It's just some people have faced consequences that have taken them down a different path, but we're no different than anybody else. When we look at things through the lens of positive psychology, I feel it really fuels that propensity towards compassion for all. So applications for thriving recovery. So what I want to do is kind of take this framework and share it in presentations just like this and show how positive psychology can be used to help people thrive in recovery. But this same framework I'm expanding into workshops. I'll be starting one in New Bern in 2 weeks, where I'm going to take these 4 different pathways and use positive psychology in a small group environment to help individuals thrive in their recovery or live into their higher potential using positive psychology. So the same framework can be used to create workshops, either small or large workshops, and be as cursory or as in-depth as the audience would like, because you can add as many pathways and as many interventions and topics as you would like. So you can either be as kind of cursory and help somebody get started in thriving in recovery, or be really in-depth. I mean, you could spend weeks looking through all the benefits of positive psychology and bringing it into your life. The same framework can be used in group coaching or individual coaching to help somebody in recovery live into their higher potential. And then finally, my future vision is to create online courses so I can really spread this content and this message and these tools to a much larger audience, and have it be something that can be replicated digitally to help spread the message to a lot of people so they can access it around the world and 24/7. But all these things can be done with this same framework in mind, the same positive psychology. So I haven't really seen any questions come up. Maybe I was talking too quickly to allow a moment for it, but if you do have any questions, please throw them in the comments box. I'm more than happy to answer them. I'd love to continue this discussion and figure out ways that we all can use positive psychology to influence our own lives and help live into our higher potential. There's some of my contact information here. Of course, you can message me on Facebook. If you're watching a rebroadcast or a replay of this, then please send me any questions that you have, send me any comments you have. If you're interested in learning more about it, you can send me an email or you can message me on Facebook. If there's anything I can do to help you or anything else positive psychology based that you'd like to hear about or discuss, then I'm always open to the conversation. I'll stay on here for another minute or two in case anybody has any questions. You can throw them in the box, and then if not now, then I'll look to see what you might have later or any way that I can help. Thanks very much for taking some time and checking out this broadcast tonight. I really appreciate you showing up and appreciate what you're doing to help live into your potential so that you can really affect those around you by setting the example for them and by empowering other people through your work and through your inspiration and through the meaning in your life. So thank you very much for that. And I look forward to continuing this conversation anytime.